Okay, I'm outside now, and I'm going to read Chapter 5, Mrs. Harrison. I should be able to read better because I can see better in the bright sunlight. The fans were making life intolerable for us, and not only when the Beatles were performing. None of them could go into or out of their flats without being grabbed, mauled, and begged for autographs at any time of day or night. Brian decided they needed to move and asked the band's accountant, Dr. Walter Strach, to find suitable houses. Walter's home was in Weybridge, Surrey, 30 miles southwest of London, so it was to that area that they migrated. John and Ringo bought grand houses in St. George's Hill, an exclusive estate that housed the rich and famous in safety and seclusion. George didn't like that idea and chose instead a modern 4-bedroom bungalow in Esher called Kinfons, about 15 or 20 minutes' drive from the others. Paul couldn't bring himself to move so far out of London and bought a house in St. John's Wood, convenient for the EMI recording studios in Abbey Road. Kinfons had been built in the early 1960s in what had previously been the walled vegetable garden of Claremont Girls' School, which had once belonged to Lord Clive, founder of Britain's Indian Empire. With the addition of a 14-foot-high gate, it was very private. The gate was operated manually, though, and it wasn't long before the marauding fans discovered where George lived. Hordes of girls used to hang about outside, waiting for me to go out. If the gate was ever left open, they would come onto the grounds. They also discovered that if they put stones into the sliding mechanism, it wouldn't shut properly and they could squeeze through. Since we never locked any doors, the occasional one got into the house. I kept finding clothes missing, and once George gave me a beautiful Piaget watch that disappeared. I presume some fan took it. Once when my brothers David and Beau were staying, they woke up to find 2 girls in the drawing room. David was delighted. The house was surrounded by 3/4 of an acre of garden, which Maurice, the gardener, looked after. Neither George nor I knew anything about gardening and had no particular interest in it. The only thing I remember planting was a climbing rose in the area by the swimming pool, where there were white wooden slats to screen it off. I was so thrilled when it grew big and beautiful that I took a photo one summer's day of the 2 of us standing in front of it. I went to great pains to set up a tripod, but George got bored waiting for the shutter to close, and it caught him looking away. I was living in Ovington Mews when George bought Kinfons, but I helped him furnish it. We went off and bought big black leather sofas and other furniture from Habitat, which Terence Conran had recently opened in Fulham Road. It was one of the first shops to specialize in good modern design and had everything from beds to butter knives. We bought a teak dining table and chairs and a pine table for the kitchen, which was where we ate most of the time. When the lease on Ovington Mews came up for renewal, Mary B. moved to Cornwall. She had had a disastrous affair and found herself a job as an au pair by way of distraction. Meanwhile, I moved into a little flat that George rented for me in South Audley Street. He was still doing a lot of touring. During the first 3 years that I knew him, the Beatles averaged 3 long tours in each, 1 British, 1 American, and 1 that took in several other countries. When they weren't touring, they were recording. The Beatles were producing about 6 singles a year and 1 album, which represented many hours of studio time. They were often in the studio from 11 in the morning until 11 at night, if not midnight. Eventually, I abandoned the flat in London, where I was lonely on my own, and moved in with George. London was only 45 minutes away, a quick whiz down the A3, easy to get to for work or play. The latter meant parties, clubs, discos, and dinners, theater, sometimes, and films. Cubby Broccoli, the James Bond producer, owned a small private viewing theater, and we were invited to see whatever new film was showing. We sat there with scotch and coke and the finest smoked salmon sandwiches. Also, we liked to go to Parks, a restaurant in Beauchamp Place, owned by an Irishman called Tom, who cooked fantastic food and decorated it with flowers. He would get tulips and turn them inside out, whence the line in one of John Lennon's songs about bent-back tulips. We usually went out as a group with other Beatles and friends, and often my sister Jenny was with us and her boyfriend, Mick Fleetwood. About a year after I'd moved in, we converted the garage at Kinfon's into a big sitting room with a little one off it as a projection room so that we could show films. I was the chief projectionist, but I think the only movie we ever saw was The Producers. We watched it all the time. George could recite nearly every line. On television, we loved Monty Python's Flying Circus. Eric Idle was one of George's heroes and often came to the house. We liked Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, too, the American comedy series that made Goldie Hawn famous. And we listened to Motown and other new artists from America. Marvin Gaye, Martha and the Vandellas, the Ronettes, the Byrds, and Dylan. The focal point of our new sitting room was a huge circular brick fireplace, inspired by Salvador Dali, whose work we liked, and we asked a Dutch couple, Simon Posthuma and Marjika Koger, known as The Fool, to paint it for us. They were talented, creative people who wore outfits they had designed and made in velvet, richly decorated with beads and sequins. We must have got to know them through Robert Fraser, who owned an art gallery in Duke Street, or John Dunbar, Marianne Faithfull's ex-husband who ran the Indica Gallery in Mason's Court, St. James. They made amazing clothes for us all, and later for the Apple Shop in Baker Street, which they also designed. On the night before the opening, they took a bunch of art students to paint psychedelic murals on the outside of the building. The painting they did for us at Kinfon's was stunning. It took months to complete, and they stayed with us while they were working on it. I so wish we could have taken it with us when we moved, but of course we couldn't. We had also covered the outside of the house with graffiti. The walls had been plain white when we moved in, so we bought some cans of spray paint and spent many happy hours cheering them up. When friends came, we would give them a can, and they added a bit here and there. There were flowers and psychedelic patterns in every color of the rainbow. Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull came to see us one day when we were out and wrote "Mick and Marianne were here" in large letters on one of the walls. Sadly, when we left Kinfon's, the new occupants painted over it. In Esher, we had a wonderful cleaner called Margaret. Whenever we had to go to Liverpool to visit George's mother, she would have macaroni cheese ready when we got back. She used to love John Lennon visiting and would say to him, "Have you got any of those lovely pills?" And John would give her an upper. Afterward, she would vacuum like a maniac, very different from her normal self. She was adorable. She believed that there was nothing beyond the sky and the clouds, and that the world was encased in a bubble. When she saw the moon landing and men walking on it, she refused to believe it was happening. When George and I first got together, I wasn't a good cook, but always quite enthusiastic. I knew there was something better than school food and even Lily's fare. I tried to make the sorts of things I imagined. When George and I first got together, I wasn't a good cook, but always quite enthusiastic. I knew there was something better than school food and even Lily's fare. I tried to make the sorts of things I imagined boys from the North would like: shepherd's pie, roast beef, and Yorkshire pudding. And then George and I became vegetarian, which gave me a whole new interest. Someone gave us a book that talked about veal farming and how cruelly the calves were treated. They were kept in tiny cages in the dark, unable to turn around, and photographs showed them licking the metal bars. It was then that we decided we would eat no more meat. Being vegetarian at that time was quite a challenge. There was so little to choose from, nothing ready-made and no meat-free equivalent of steak or sausages that you could cook with minimal preparation. I had to create things myself and discovered I loved doing it. I cooked for our friends, George's family and mine, and anyone who came to see or stay with us. We gave lunch and supper parties, and I enjoyed buying the food. I would go into the health food shop in Esher for beans and grains, vegetables and fruit. I had hundreds of cookbooks. For a while I read nothing else. I was vegetarian for about 7 years, but George remained so until the day he died, and would not allow meat or fish to be cooked or eaten in his house. We spent a lot of time in the kitchen. It was the heart of the house. I remember George sitting at the table with his guitar, writing the song that became My Sweet Lord. When it came out as a single and went to number 1, he was taken to court because an American group called the Chiffons recorded a song called He's So Fine, and the song's music publisher claimed that George had stolen it. It was tricky for him. I knew he had written it. I was there when he was working on it. But he had to take his guitar to court and play in front of the judge to prove that the melody was original and not based on their song. The judge found him guilty of subconscious plagiarism. After that, we never had a radio playing in the house in case he was unconsciously influenced by a song he had heard. His guitars were always left around the house, and in any spare moment he would pick one up and play. When John, Paul, Ringo, or any other musician appeared, as they often did, they all played. But George would never play a complete song. He played what was in his head, or he would be working on new chords or a new song. I never knew which, and weeks later you would hear a song on tape. I loved listening to him. I loved the sound of the guitar in the house. Sometimes I would start to talk, and he'd be so deep in thought about the lyrics or the melody he was writing that he wouldn't answer. We'd be in the same room, but he wasn't really with me. He was in his head. Most of the time I didn't mind. I'd think, oh good, he's writing a new song. He was always happiest when he was being creative. Sometimes songs would come to him in the middle of the night, and he would wake up in the morning and immediately start to play so he didn't forget it. He would change chords, then stop because something didn't sound right. John and Paul wrote most of their songs together. They sparked off each other, but George wrote on his own. He composed the melody first, but as he was not formally trained, he couldn't write the music down. He would play it, so it was fixed in his mind, then record it. The words came later. Sometimes I tried to help if he couldn't find a word to rhyme with another, but most of the time he did it alone, writing on the backs of envelopes anything that came to hand. He composed all over the world, wherever he happened to be, and he would play me a tape recording of the things he had written. He didn't sing them to me with the guitar, and I always thought how much better it sounded like that than the finished product. A lot of fan mail came to the house, and when George's mother was down from Liverpool, she would take it away and answer it. In the meantime, it would stack up, mountains of envelopes in cardboard boxes. I'll never forget coming home one day and finding the boxes all over the floor, the letters scattered far and wide. It looked as though we had been burglared. As I put it back, I noticed that one envelope had been opened. It was addressed to Corky, our adorable white Persian cat, named after the character in the Dandy comic, and contained a ball of catnip, the herb cats go mad about. Clever thing, he'd found it and opened his own fan mail. Irritatingly, Corky seemed to prefer life in the girls' school next door, but perhaps that was because I was away so much. I was working regularly in Paris. I did a lot for Elle and a few pages for American Vogue, where I met Diana Vreeland, its longtime editor-in-chief. Before that, she had been fashion editor of Harper's Bazaar for 25 years and was a formidable woman. I was fascinated by her eyes. She put Vaseline on the bones above them. She wore her black hair scraped back and was very tall, thin, and grand. I was working for Bailey and not eating much, and I passed out on some steps outside the studio and missed my flight home. When I finally got back to Esher, I found George's brother Pete and his wife Pauline installed in the house. They had come to have their holidays at Kinfon's. I was so annoyed, I made dinner for them, and they wouldn't eat it because they said they only ate at 6 o'clock. I became very fond of George's parents. They were quite short and very Liverpudlian. Harold drove buses and Louise worked part-time at a greengrocer's. She had always been supportive of George. She had bought him his first guitar when he was 14. She didn't object to the long hair, the boots, or the jeans he made tighter with her sewing machine. George was their youngest child. His sister, also Louise, had immigrated to America, but wrote often telling him to get a proper job. His eldest brother, Harry, was a fitter, and Peter a mechanic. Harold had not wanted George to leave school so young. He thought education was the way to success. He had wanted him to take an apprenticeship like his brothers, and was afraid that he would never make a living as a musician. But his mother was all for it, and one of the Beatles' staunchest supporters. All she wanted for her children was that they should be happy, and she recognized that nothing made George quite as happy as making music. George was generous to his family. He loved them. He bought his parents a bungalow, which they were thrilled with. He took me to see the house they had had before, the one in which he had grown up, and it was in a very poor part of town. The bungalow always had that distinctive new house smell and had a nice little garden. We would go and see them for tea, but it wasn't tea as I knew it, not tea and biscuits or cake. It was only when I went to his parents' house that I realized George had been brought up very differently from me. Because he and I always had a cup of tea in the afternoon and dinner at 8 or 9 in the evening, I had assumed that this was the way he had always lived, but of course he had not. His family held their knives like pens, and tea consisted of cold ham or pork pie, tomatoes cut in half, pickled beetroot, and salad cream, with sliced white bread. They had it at 6 o'clock, and later in the evening there was tea and biscuits. They drank little alcohol. His father had an occasional beer. I remember taking them with me on a trip to Paris, just the three of us, and giving them dinner on a boat on the Seine. They loved it. Drink hadn't been a big part of my life before I met George. I might have had wine with Eric Swain. There was a lovely restaurant called Bistro Vino just across the road from my flat, and we ate there quite often, but I drank little. George wasn't a wine drinker until he arrived in London, where Brian Epstein introduced him to it. When we went to places like Annabelle's, I would write down the names of some of the wines Brian ordered, which we had enjoyed, like Chateau Neuf du Pape, Clos de Vouguenot, and Nuit Saint-Georges. Brian changed things for all of the Beatles, taught them more sophisticated ways. He came from Liverpool too, but a smart area. His parents owned a well-established furniture shop in which he had opened a music department called NEMS, North End Music Store, and had been privately educated. He was also older than they were, 27 when he started managing them, and more experienced in the ways of the world. Unlike me, George was never hungry, so we didn't eat much. We would have a cup of tea for breakfast, maybe fried eggs, then nothing. For lunch, in the evening, I was always ravenous. We were in the E-Type one day, driving through Liphook or Lindhead, and stopped at a little tea room because I was starving. As we walked in, an elderly lady said, "It's 3 and 6 each, you know," and we laughed because we must have looked as though we couldn't afford it. George loved cars. All of the Beatles did. After the E-Type, he bought a silver Aston Martin DB5 and a Mini-Moke, a little Jeep-like car with no doors and no roof that was really fun in the summer. People would cruise up and down the King's Road in them, and George would often collect David and Bo from the station in it when they came to stay. He also bought a 1928 Rolls-Royce. My brother David remembers sitting in the bucket seat in the back of the DB5, asking me where Eric Swain was and getting the most thunderous look from me. David worshipped George. He was his only male role model, and they would talk for hours. George would give him things to take to school, which would impress his friends. And if David liked a particular pair of trousers George wore, a shirt or a silk jacket, George gave it to him. The combination of drinking a lot of alcohol and not eating enough took its toll on my body, and after a while I developed a kidney problem. It may have been something to do with the slimming pills too, or the diet biscuits. Whatever the cause, it was very painful. My doctor, Tony Greenberg, repeatedly gave me pills that would gradually improve things, but the condition kept recurring. One day I heard about a weekend workshop being held in Wiltshire, somewhere near the Welsh border. I don't remember who was running it, but there was some connection with Lord Harlech. And as George was away, I booked myself into it. I had met David Harlech many times. I knew his children. Jane, Victoria, Alice, and Julian Ormsby Gore were friends, part of the King's Road set, and Jane married Michael Rainey, who ran Hung on You, the boutique. I had been to the family house, Glyn, at Gwynedd in Wales with them. There were always crowds of people there, and David Harlech was a wonderful man. He had been British ambassador in Washington and a friend of the Kennedys. His wife had been killed in a car crash shortly before I met him, and he was left to look after their 5 children on his own. He married again in 1969, and we were at the wedding, looking very hippie-ish. I was thrilled to meet the former Conservative Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan. On the way to the workshop, I stopped at a chemist and filled yet another prescription for my kidney disorder. I arrived not knowing a soul and thinking I'd made a big mistake. As we sat down for dinner, the man next to me started to analyze my gesticulations. He said he hadn't been able to talk until the age of 7 and had learned to study people. Then someone else spoke, and I realized my companions were healers. Another man asked how I was. I confessed that I wasn't feeling very well, and he stopped me from saying any more. He took out a crystal on a length of string, held it over me, and after a few minutes said quietly, "Yes, it's your kidneys." I was amazed. I told him about the pills the doctor had prescribed, and he said, "You can take them or not, as you like, but do please take these." And he gave me a homeopathic remedy. I still don't know what caused the problem, but I certainly know what fixed it. I took the remedy and have never had kidney trouble since. In the summer of 1965, George was away on another long tour of America, and I had my sister Jenny to stay at Kinfon's. I still had the flat in South Audley Street, but I spent little time there. The only problem was that George always seemed to be going away. Eventually he told Brian he'd had enough of touring. He hated it. They all hated it. They were sick of singing the same songs, which no one could hear because of the screaming. They were sick of the motorcades, the security, and the fans' insanity. They were also sick of being away from home, particularly George. He became more and more lonely and phoned me every day. Or if the time difference made it impossible, he wrote. I couldn't have gone on tour with him because of my work, but Brian wouldn't have let me anyway because wives and girlfriends would have been too much for the security men. But Kenny Everett, the Radio 1 disc jockey in America with them, but Kenny Everett, the Radio 1 disc jockey, was in America with them, and every afternoon when we were sitting by the pool at Kinfon's, we would turn on the radio and listen to the Beatles chatting to him. At other times when he was touring, I went away. In the summer of 1966, I asked Mary B. and Belinda to come to the south of France with me. The Beatles' office arranged a flat for us in Monte Carlo, which by a strange coincidence belonged to Rudolf Nureyev. All the towels were monogrammed RN. The new 60s fashions we were wearing in London hadn't yet arrived further afield, and everyone stared at us in our short skirts. We seemed to be the only people wearing them. We felt awkward and uncomfortable, so we hired a car and drove down the coast to Saint-Tropez, where no one turned a hair. It was much more fun than Monte Carlo, and we kept bumping into people we vaguely knew. One of them was Alexander Weymouth, then heir to the Marquis of Bath, who invited us to stay at his house in the hills for a few days. The rest of the time we stayed with my French friend Zuzu. I met her modeling a couple of years before, who took us to all the cool clubs where I gave the DJs the first pressing of Good Day Sunshine. It was a lovely holiday. Every morning the first one up would roll a joint and put on the Byrds, whose music filled the flat. The sun shone. We hadn't a care in the world. George didn't want to meet new people or go to new places. He was happy to visit my old friends and our families, but he was wary of newcomers, unless they were musicians. One evening, some months before we had been invited to dinner by a Mr. Angardi, who ran the Asian Music Circle in London, and his English wife, who painted a large portrait of the two of us, for which we sat on several occasions. Mr. Angardi wanted George to meet a sitar player called Ravi Shankar. Ravi was well known in classical music circles and a hero in his own country, India. They talked music all evening, and George was awestruck. Soon afterwards, Ravi came to Kinfon's to give George a sitar lesson. At one point the phone rang, and George put down the sitar, stood up, and went to answer it, stepping over the sitar as he did so. Ravi whacked him sharply on the leg and said, "You must have more respect for the instrument." The technique involved in playing the sitar is quite different from anything George had known before. He had to sit on the floor for hours cross-legged, with the bowl of the gourd resting on the ball of his left foot. In no time at all, his legs were in agony. However, he and Ravi became friends, and a couple months later, Ravi invited George and me to India, where he would be our guide for spiritual, musical, and cultural lessons. We flew to Bombay, and I was overwhelmed by the noise, the heat, and the mass of humanity. The road between the airport and the center of the city was a seething tangle of cars, bicycles, carts, cows, dogs, tuk-tuks, and people all going somewhere. The noise of car horns and bicycle bells was relentless. We stayed in the Taj Hotel, a grand Victorian building opposite the Gateway of India, and from our window, safely from the Malay, watched men and women going about their business. Ravi arranged yoga classes every morning to teach George how to sit and hold the sitar, followed by several hours of lessons and practice with him and his other students. After about a month, we traveled together around India. Among many others, we met Ravi's spiritual guru, Tat Baba, who explained the law of karma to us both, the law of action and reaction, or cause and effect. Ravi was respected by all over India. His students would bow down at his feet. Ravi was respected all over India. His students would bow down at his feet. He gave concerts across the country, and people would sit, sometimes until 4 o'clock in the morning, to listen to him play, accompanied by Ali Raka on tabla and harmonium, where his students kept time. They counted the beat, which confused me. It was unlike Western classical or even rock beat. I found it intensely moving. These were not just concerts. There was something profoundly spiritual about the experience. Ravi told us that sometimes he would go into a meditative state and not know consciously what he was playing. We visited many jewels of India with him: the Taj Mahal, Jodhpur, Jaipur, Agra, Delhi, temples with ancient carvings of gods and goddesses in love, fighting, and sometimes disguised as demons. We met some holy men who were more than 100 years old, and sadhus who live in abject poverty. We visited the sacred ghats of Benares, where people are cremated and have their ashes scattered in the Ganges. It was an astonishing sight to see bodies burning on the banks as we stepped out of the boat to walk up to a ghat. I was unable to look away, although I wanted to. We went to a festival of Kumbh Mela, the most sacred of all Hindu pilgrimages, which attracts millions of people from all over India. We found ourselves in a crowd of about 3,000, most of who had come on foot. We watched as the compound filled, pink dust rising, and in the distance I saw the Maharaja riding an elephant, followed by a prince on a smaller one. They dismounted and sat on a dais where two wallahs kept them cool by wafting peacock feather fans. Meanwhile, a man sat at our feet with a length of bamboo. Every now and then he would lean forward and stick his tongue into the hollow stick. Ravi told us there was a poisonous snake inside it. Each time the man extended his tongue, the snake struck, which gave him a high. When everyone was assembled, we watched a religious play with wooden characters 20 feet high, mounted on wheeled trolleys that moved back and forth across the area. I felt as if I had been transported back 2,000 years to biblical times. We ended the trip in Kashmir, where we stayed on a houseboat, George and I, Ravi and his girlfriend Kamala. I was moored near a floating garden on Lake Dal, and one night the man who owned the boat invited us to dinner at his house. As a Muslim, he didn't allow the women of the house to meet George or Ravi. When we arrived, we were given tea. Then Kamala and I were taken to meet the women. Communication was a bit limited, but even Kamala didn't speak their language. When we rejoined the men, we all sat down to dinner. Later the cook appeared, and we heard his story. He had been bought as a child and castrated so that he could work with women in the kitchen. The Beatles lived an unreal life, and other musicians were the only people who shared it. They had found fame when they were so young. George was just 17 when they were playing in Hamburg, Paul and John a couple of years older, and they had done nothing but work ever since. They hadn't had a chance to grow up in the way most people do, and from the moment fame hit, they had been so bombarded by fans and hangers-on, so cocooned by Brian Epstein, that they never knew whom they could trust. In many respects, they were still children. They had few real friends apart from each other, and when they were asked questions, they could answer as one. They were so much on each other's wavelength. If one went to a gallery opening, they all went. If one bought a new car or a new house, they all did. If one seemed in danger of taking himself too seriously, the others knocked it out of him. They knew little about life, and with Brian looking after their every need, they had no reason to learn. Money was never a motivating force. They enjoyed the toys it brought them, but they never had any idea of how much they had. If they wanted something, they asked Brian. One December evening, we were in London, and George stopped the car and said, "Let's get married." "Let's get married. I'll speak to Brian." He stopped in Chapel Street outside Brian's house, rushed in, leaving me in the car, came back 15 minutes later and said, "Brian says it's okay. Will you marry me? We can get married in January." "Oh yes," I said, "that would be fabulous." I was thrilled, but George had to ask Brian's permission in case another tour was planned. We were married on January 21st, 1966. It was not the wedding I had dreamed of. I would have loved to be married in church, but Brian didn't want a big fuss. They all trusted him so implicitly that when he said it should be a quiet register office wedding, George agreed. He also said it had to be secret. If the press found out, it would be chaotic. I had always thought I'd have a big white wedding, as all little girls do, then have children and live happily ever after, not be divorced like my mother. As a child, I thought I'd do anything to avoid divorce. I even considered waiting until I was 40 to marry, because by that time I would have had my fun and there would be no chance of a marriage breaking up. But there I was at 21 marrying George, who was all of 22. But I was so happy and so much in love, I didn't care. Divorce didn't enter my head. We would be together and happy forever. He didn't give me an engagement ring, but we did go to Gerard, the Royal Jewelers in Regent Street, to choose my wedding ring. There was a lot of fuss when we arrived. All the assistants were excited, and the top man was called out from the back to serve us. The ring I chose was a wide gold band that looked like a little brick wall made from yellow, pink, and white gold. It was so unusual, flexible, and felt lovely on my finger. I didn't buy George a ring. He didn't want to wear one. Few men did in those days. I bought a Mary Quant pinky red short silk dress, which came to just above the knee, and wore it with creamy stockings and pointy red shoes. On top, because it was January and cold, I wore a red fox fur coat, also by Mary Quant, that George gave me. She made George a beautiful black Mongolian lamb coat. The ceremony took place early in the morning at Epsom Registry Office in Surrey, not the most glamorous place, and the room was very hot and stuffy. Brian Epstein was there, and Paul McCartney, who was George's best man. Otherwise it was family. My mother, with her cousin Penny Evans, who had been around a lot while I was growing up, Colin, Jenny, Paula, David, and Boo, George's parents and brothers. Unlike John, my mother's twin brother gave me away. Uncle John, my mother's twin brother, gave me away. He lived in Africa, and although we children didn't see much of him as we were growing up, he was probably the main male influence in our lives. We adored him, and Jenny and I both held him in higher regard than either our real father or our stepfather. He was a writer. He had been stationed in the desert in Africa during the Second World War, and afterward worked for Reuters. Then he went to Singapore and wrote a book about it, and later returned to Africa, where he is still, aged 83. He lives in Somalia, speaks the language fluently, and is helping the Somalis to map their land. He has hardly paid a penny, but he cares deeply about the people and can't bear the idea of coming back to Britain. My mother thought I should invite Jock Boyd, my father, to the wedding, so I wrote to him at an address in Devon. He had apparently been living there with a new wife for several years. I didn't know how to address him. Daddy? Jock? Mr. Boyd? In the end, I called him Daddy. I said, I am going to marry George. He comes from Liverpool. I'm sure you'd like him, and if you'd like to come to our wedding, please do. He wrote back saying he forbade me to marry someone so young whose family he hadn't met. He didn't come. Uncle John not only gave me away, he saved the day. After the ceremony, we all went back to Kinfon's for lunch, and the photographer Brian had booked had a problem with his camera. He couldn't synchronize the flash. John came to the rescue with a little Instamatic he had just bought in Selfridges, and took the photos at the reception. There was no shortage of pictures of us leaving the register office. We came out into the street to find dozens of press photographers lined up outside. So much for keeping the whole thing secret. We traveled to and from Epsom in a Rolls-Royce Princess, and after the ceremony, David, who was then about 12, walked out beside George and me. Not knowing wedding protocol, he jumped into the back of the car ahead of us. Wrong car, said George very quietly, so no one else could hear. At the reception, David sat between George's father and Paul McCartney, with the other, Mrs. Harrison, one place away. David and Boo should have been at school, but came to the wedding instead. Maybe that's Bo. David and Bo should have been at school, but came to the wedding instead. They went to the most horrible schools. Bobby had little money, but felt that the boys would be better off away from my mother. I now discover, and persuaded the council to foot the bill for 2 boarding schools. Even at that age, David was very independent and a bit of a rebel, and out of school thought he could safely have a cigarette. What he hadn't bargained on was George's mother, who told him to put it out at once. When Paul realized that David and Bo were bored, he took them outside in search of fun. In a disused loo, with hundreds of fan letters waiting for Mrs. Harrison's attention, they found George's bow and arrows. Paul showed the boys how to use it. David pulled back the string, and Paul watched the arrow score a direct hit on the bonnet of his gleaming Rolls-Royce. After our wedding, we had to endure a press conference that Brian had set up. It was so terrifying that I have almost blanked it from my memory. Lots of reporters asked questions about when George had asked me to marry him and our plans for the future. George said he had proposed on the day we met, on the train filming A Hard Day's Night, and I said I hadn't thought he was serious. He then said he'd asked me out and I turned him down, and I blurred out that we'd like 3 children, but not immediately. There was plenty of time. And I blurted out that we'd like 3 children, but not immediately. There was plenty of time. We spent our honeymoon in Barbados in a fabulous rented villa called Benclair at Gibbs Beach, on what is now the Sandy Lane estate. It was perched on a hill with a sweeping lawn to the main road, views of the sea, and a full staff. One day we were out in the garden, and the maid said, "Oh, look, there's the Queen of England." Sure enough, there she was, driving past in an open-topped car, waving to everyone, with Prince Philip sitting beside her, head buried in a newspaper. We spent beautiful sunny days exploring the island, playing in the sea, and having romantic dinners at home to the sound of the ever-present tree frogs. We lounged on the beach, went to the famous Sandy Lane Hotel, swam, talked, and walked, and I was so happy I thought I might burst. It was bliss to have George to myself, no work pulling either of us, and no fans making life a misery. We didn't know anyone on the island, and there were few tourists at that time, but gradually word got out that we were there, so we posed a couple of times for the local press, and then the local dignitaries wanted to be photographed with us. We made a few friends, including the eccentric George Drummond of the banking family, who lived there. He showed us around the island and gave parties for us to meet other locals. A lot of people still lived in the old wooden chattel houses, built on blocks so they could be lifted up and moved with shutters on every window and painted blue, pink, or yellow. The island was full of life and color, cascading bougainvilleas in every shade, flame-red trees, smartly dressed school children in uniform, pretty brown, black, and white goats. After a week, some friends who were in New York came to join us. Terry Howard was the creative director of an advertising agency, and his girlfriend, Venetia Cunningham, was a model, another face in the Birds of Britain book. One day we took them up to an old hotel on the northern tip of the island where it was very wild and windy, and in those days undeveloped. It is the point at which the Caribbean meets the Atlantic, so there are big seas and strong currents. The owner had invited us to a picnic lunch. There was a huge swimming pool overlooking the sea, and, as everywhere in Barbados, a beautiful sandy beach. We said we'd like to be on the beach rather than by the pool, so we went down some stone steps that led to it from the hotel garden and found a perfect spot on which to lie and sunbathe. The sand was silky soft, but so hot in the midday sun that we couldn't sit on it for long. Soon we raced into the sea to cool down. George and I swam a little further out than the others, but as we headed back towards the shore, we suddenly discovered we were making no progress. We were about 60 yards from the beach, swimming and swimming, but moving nowhere. George and I looked at each other, and he said very calmly, "Just keep swimming, don't panic." We could see Terry and Venetia at the water's edge, but they were blissfully unaware of our predicament and probably wouldn't have heard our shouts over the noise of the waves. Every time a wave came, we tried to use it to inch a little further, but then the fierce undertow took us out to sea again. Eventually, after about half an hour, we made it and collapsed, exhausted, onto the sand. We were desperate for something to drink and ravenously hungry. As if by a miracle, a waiter appeared at that precise moment with a huge jug of lemonade, tinkling with ice, and a silver platter laden with delicious things to eat. Horror of horrors, no sooner had he put them down on the sand beside us than a huge wave whooshed up the beach and swallowed our lunch, tray and all. The sea was ferocious in that northern part, which I now know was why the hotel had such a glorious swimming pool. Recently, I was in Barbados and went back to see the beach. 40 years on, the hotel is in ruins, the swimming pool too. But I found the stone steps to the beach overgrown and unused, and felt a shiver run down my spine. That's the end of chapter 5. Okay, I'm outside now, and I'm going to read chapter 5, Mrs. Harrison. I should be able to read better because I can see better in the bright sunlight. The fans were making life intolerable for us, and not only when the Beatles were performing. None of them could go into or out of their flats without being grabbed, mauled, and begged for autographs at any time of day or night. Brian decided they needed to move and asked the band's accountant, Dr. Walter Strach, to find suitable houses. Walter's home was in Weybridge, Surrey, 30 miles southwest of London, so it was to that area that they migrated. John and Ringo bought grand houses in St. George's Hill, an exclusive estate that housed the rich and famous in safety and seclusion. George didn't like that idea and chose instead a modern 4-bedroom bungalow in Esher called Kinfons, about 15 or 20 minutes' drive from the others. Paul couldn't bring himself to move so far out of London and bought a house in St. John's Wood, convenient for the EMI recording studios in Abbey Road, and had no particular interest in it. The only thing I remember planting was a climbing rose in the area by the swimming pool, where there were white wooden slats to screen it off. I was so thrilled when it grew big and beautiful that I took a photo one summer's day of the two of us standing in front of it. I went to great pains to set up a tripod, but George got bored waiting for the shutter to close, and it caught him looking away. I was living in Ovington Mews when George bought Kinfons, but I helped him furnish it. We went off and bought big black leather sofas and other furniture from Habitat, which Terence Conran had recently opened in Fulham Road. It was one of the first shops to specialize in good modern design and had everything from beds to butter knives. We bought a teak dining table and chairs and a pine table for the kitchen, which was where we ate most of the time. When the lease on Ovington Mews came up for renewal, Mary B. moved to Cornwall. She had had a disastrous affair and found herself a job as an au pair by way of distraction. Meanwhile, I moved into a little flat that George rented for me in South. Kinfons had been built in the early 1960s in what had previously been the walled vegetable garden of Claremont Girls' School, which had once belonged to Lord Clive, founder of Britain's Indian Empire. With the addition of a 14-foot-high gate, it was very private. The gate was operated manually, though, and it wasn't long before the marauding fans discovered where George lived. Hordes of girls used to hang about outside, waiting for me to go out. If the gate was ever left open, they would come onto the grounds. They also discovered that if they put stones into the sliding mechanism, it wouldn't shut properly and they could squeeze through. Since we never locked any doors, the occasional one got into the house. I kept finding clothes missing, and once George gave me a beautiful Piaget watch that disappeared. I presume some fan took it. Once when my brothers David and Beau were staying, they woke up to find 2 girls in the drawing room. David was delighted. The house was surrounded by 3/4 of an acre of garden, which Maurice, the gardener, looked after. Neither George nor I knew anything about gardening. Tom, who cooked fantastic food and decorated it with flowers. He would get tulips and turn them inside out, whence the line in one of John Lennon's songs about bent-back tulips. We usually went out as a group with other Beatles and friends, and often my sister Jenny was with us and her boyfriend, Mick Fleetwood. About a year after I'd moved in, we converted the garage at Kinfon's into a big sitting room with a little one off it as a projection room so that we could show films. I was the chief projectionist, but I think the only movie we ever saw was The Producers. We watched it all the time. George could recite nearly every line. On television, we loved Monty Python's Flying Circus. Eric Idle was one of George's heroes and often came to the house. We liked Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, too, the American comedy series that made Goldie Hawn famous. And we listened to Motown and other new artists from America. Marvin Gaye, Martha and the Vandellas, the Ronettes, the Byrds, and Dylan. The focal point of our new sitting room was a huge circular brick fire on Audley Street. He was still doing a lot of touring. During the first 3 years that I knew him, the Beatles averaged 3 long tours in each, 1 British, 1 American, and 1 that took in several other countries. When they weren't touring, they were recording. The Beatles were producing about 6 singles a year, and 1 album, which represented many hours of studio time. They were often in the studio from 11 in the morning until 11 at night, if not midnight. Eventually, I abandoned the flat in London, where I was lonely on my own, and moved in with George. London was only 45 minutes away, a quick whiz down the A3, easy to get to for work or play. The latter meant parties, clubs, discos, and dinners, theater, sometimes, and films. Cubby Broccoli, the James Bond producer, owned a small private viewing theater, and we were invited to see whatever new film was showing. We sat there with scotch and coke and the finest smoked salmon sandwiches. Also, we liked to go to Parks, a restaurant in Beauchamp Place, owned by an Irishman called